Hi, everybody. Welcome to All the Forbidden Things. This is the show where we talk about things that we're probably not talking about with each other in ways that we're probably not talking about with each other. The format of the show is that we ask each other questions based on perceptions and kind of what we think the other person's experience of us or of themselves might have been. And we try to take a guess at the answer for them and then reveal the truth. So, in this episode, we'll be talking about psychedelics, including ayahuasca, with my very dear friend, Emily Beta. Emily and I know each other from college, and we took two writing classes together, right? Yeah.
Yes.
And we've been friends for a very long time, and we're very close. I know a lot about her, and I know a lot about her experiences with this topic, personally and professionally. And yet, I'm convinced that we're going to find out some things today that we don't know about each other on this topic. So, yeah, Emily, do you want to go ahead and kind of introduce yourself and like what your relationship is to it and how you've been involved?
Yeah, sure. So I had my first experience with psychedelics probably shortly after I met you because we met senior year of NYU in creative writing class. And I think the summer after college, I took mushrooms for the first time. And that was really, to be honest, it was a really scary experience. Because at that point too, I mean, this is back in the day, 2011, there wasn't all this research and it wasn't in the media as a potentially therapeutic thing. It was kind of just doing drugs with my friends in the park. And I almost chickened out, to be honest. Like my friend was like, "Where are you?" And I had gotten my period that morning, and I had taken ibuprofen, and I was like, "I don't think I can do it anymore because I'm on ibuprofen, and I might that might have a bad experience with the mushroom." So I was obviously just very um, nervous and anxious, and I had no idea what would happen. Um, but I ended up having a really beautiful and profound experience, and it was kind of the first first time in a way that I had really connected with kind of the deeper part of myself, like really the soulful part of myself. Even though of course I had connected with her so many times through different spiritual practices or creative practices or just being in a flow state. This was kind of the first time I would say that I really believed in those experiences. I really believed that they were a lot more magical and mystical and spiritual than I had previously thought before.
Mm. Awesome. Well, do you want to start getting into the questions? Can I ask you start it off?
Yes, please.
Okay. All right. So you said that you did it shortly after kind of we met. And what I want to know is what you thought my perception was, including thinking about the period in time of you telling me about your experience.
To be honest, I don't think I talked to you about it.
When did you share with me?
I'm
Way
so
later?
Probably because I mean, this first experience I had with mushrooms when I was maybe 23 or so, and we were friends, but I was definitely very private about it because
Mm.
I wasn't sure how other people would react or what they would say. And again, we didn't have all of the research and all of the knowledge that we have now. So I probably didn't tell you. I'm not sure that it was something that we talked about until much later.
Yeah,
But
I'm trying to think. I do have an experience of not in particular, and probably especially related to the first time you did ayahuasca. Though, again, maybe we weren't very close at that moment in time, because for context, everyone, as many people do, right after college, we were not as much in contact and then reconnected in contact for years now. So there was that period where but I feel like you did ayahuasca for the first time with me in your life. Um, but I do have an experience of like you describing this thing that I had never done and I thought sounded really exciting. And I remember thinking that you're very brave because I get freaked out by things like that because it's sort of the ibuprofen thing on crack. I'm like, well, I have a mental health disorder and I'm taking this thing. And I remember the first time I did psychedelics was was uh oh, I don't know how much I want to reveal on this episode. No, but I was it one of the psychedelics got swapped out for another, and I thought I was going to do mushrooms on this trip with some friends, and it was something else. And when they presented it to me, first of all, I was like really nervous about it to begin with, and then when they presented to me, I was like, "No, that's real drugs. Like we can't do that. Oh no!" And then I went through this whole period of thinking like peer pressure and oh my god, am I going to be that person that's like, kids don't do drugs, and then I'm going to do the drugs? So I had that experience before you were telling me. Yeah, at least we'll talk about the ayahuasca part of it then, before you told me that. So I think I was like, oh my gosh, she's so brave. And I also have this perception of ayahuasca that it's this very like natural, like extreme spiritual experience. So I think I just thought like you're very courageous and fascinating, and like I just wanted to live through you.
Oh, thank you. But should I cut in with the question of like, because you hadn't, you know, you did say you had an experience with psychedelics. How did that influence kind of your perception of?
So I um I think it made me more comfortable probably with the idea of like it didn't sound quite as exotic or scary as it might have. Like if I hadn't had an experience, I think I might have been like, "Oh my god, are you sure?" Like or like, "Wow, I can't believe it." Like, "Oh my gosh, that's not for like regular people. That's like a thing that like extreme people do or something." That's probably what I would have perceived.
Mm,
Did
mhm.
you have we are going off the format because I realized I answered something you should have answered for me. Haha. Did you have and did you what did you think that my experience was?
Of psychedelics?
Yeah, of you telling me about like your experiences and like what did you think my perception of you was, like how I was receiving that and what I thought about
So I guess we're fast forwarding like 10 years from that first almost
it?
experience, even though there was a moment, I think a shift, and I don't know, where you did share, and this was when we were in LA together, where you did share an experience that you had with me. And I think
Mm.
that almost like softened me towards you, where I was like, all right, she gets it. So
Oh.
it wasn't completely out of nowhere that this was something that I wanted to talk to you about. But I think honestly, once I started like the first ayahuasca ceremony that I participated in, I at that point I really had and I had always believed this. I had always believed this from the first time I had tried psychedelics. I had always believed that they were um that it was a spiritual process, that it was a spiritual type of ceremony, that when you use psychedelics with intention, when you use them with purpose, that it's not so different than meditating or having a really deep and profound conversation with a friend or a therapist where you unlock all of these hidden drawers within yourself. I really started to understand that psychedelics were not just like fun times on drugs, like it's not like taking cocaine or at a party and just forgetting what happens. It's not like that at all. And I think if that's the energy you bring to psychedelics, usually maybe you'll have fun, but you won't have the best experiences, I think, is because this is not really how they're meant to be used.
Mm.
That's kind of how our
Mhm.
culture and our society has us use substances more of an escape, more of as a way to forget about our problems for a bit. Whereas really psychedelics are meant to shine the light on our darkness, on our shadow, so we can learn more about ourselves. So I think the more experience I had with them, especially after I tried ayahuasca, the more I trusted that this was a spiritual experience. This was no different than, when it came to really revealing this shadow, it was the same as engaging in therapy or engaging in any sort of healing process. And I knew you were on that team. I knew you had a lot of work. I knew you had been doing a lot of work on that. And we both went through, we both had similar wounds and trauma in some ways, and we really connected over that. So I just, I don't know. I trusted you as a friend, and I also trusted you as a person who knew about, like the mystical side of life and the divinity, and I didn't necessarily think that you were a person that needed to take ayahuasca in order to get it. There's like in
Mhm.
the diary of Anais Nin, like she has a lot of resistance to people doing LSD, like in the 70s, and she's just so much of her diary is just like her being like wrestling with it. It's like, why do people need LSD? Like, I'm just in this creative flow connecting to God all of the time. And I think it's a really interesting perspective because they are the same. Like in a lot of ways. I mean, psychedelics can just unlock and help us access parts of ourselves, but we can also access through any sort of creative practice, or any sort of making art, through a lot of different realms. So I find that really fascinating. Like I feel like some of my friends, I don't know if they've ever even like smoked weed or touched a drug in their life, but they don't need to, because my sister is actually a lot like this, because she's just so awake and alive and connected to the source energy that it's just not necessary for her. She gets it,
Mhm.
and I feel the same way with you.
It's interesting though, because I would have said that that's true of you too. And then I would say that, like, I think, but I think you're a little bit more grounded than I am. So I think that's part of what scares me in some substances, where it's like I know people are going to have a powerful experience and I'm kind of like, but I'm already a little crazy. Um like, what's
It's
going to
totally
happen to me in those
obviously
moments?
me.
And no, but I just feel like you're somebody who can like keep your feet on the ground a little bit and like push through a bad trip, or something, and
Yeah,
like you'll be fine. And then I'm kind of like, I might never come back. But that actually speaks to something I want to ask you, which is, can you take a guess at, like, I knew that it was a spiritual experience, but until you started like giving me updates after various times taking it and like things you realized about yourself, what do you think I thought like logistically happens? Like, is it just good feelings, or is it like random realizations? Like, what did you think my visualization of the experience was?
that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I think it's so hard to translate through words.
Mhm.
And I mean, it's almost like trying to explain like a physical breakthrough that you might have in, let's say, in a therapy session or something, or even like running a marathon, and you have this out of body experience where you're having the runner's high, and you're outside of
Mhm.
your body watching yourself run, or um I didn't necessarily think that you would see what I saw through the visions, but I
Mhm.
trusted, because I know that you're a creative and a spiritual person. I trusted that you would understand that feeling, what that feeling of a breakthrough is, because it transcends words, it transcends visual imagery. It happens within ourselves, it happens within our bodies. We break through something, we understand something. And whether that's, I think, like a giant cliche of like, everything is love, even pain is love. Like, I mean, that's not something that translates well to words. And I think that's why, we have all of these cliches that just sound so silly until you feel that shift in your body, until you understand something like on a cellular level. So I think when I communicated, my experiences with you, and I told them to you, it wasn't necessarily like, oh, she's gonna see that awesome sunset with the rainbow coming out of it and then the turtle coming behind it. Like I never thought I could just like give you that image. But maybe I could give you the feeling of that image. Maybe I could give you the feeling of what it meant to have that have that connection to meaning and
Mhm.
divinity.
It's interesting because now that we're talking about it more, and then you're putting things out there like the turtle and the rainbow, I'm like, wait, she was seeing turtles and rainbows. So I've come on a journey with, and it's so funny because, and that's what I like about this show is because there's all these machinations going on that we don't really consciously think about, but we're like always a little bit curious, like, oh, I wonder what that's like. So I guess I always perceived about ayahuasca and probably also in your experience of it that people would like maybe be struggling with something or seeking something and then the answer would just kind of come to them or
Mhm.
they'd suddenly feel like connected to themselves in this way but then um like in my psychedelic experience which is and I think that's something that's important to distinguish if you've never had experiences is that all of the different substances kind of have a different experience. So the one that I did is like a more common one. Well, actually, I also did mushrooms, but anyway, we all know what I'm talking about. And I remember sitting by the fire and just feeling like I had merged with the ground and I was just staring at the fire. And I remember thinking, like, I just want to remember this in this part of my brain. I could like feel it, just like, I just want to remember what it's like to like realize that we are all like, we're the same. Like, and I felt so heavy, like that there was no separation between myself and the things around me. Um, but then in my perception with ayahuasca, it was more like you would be like, I'm suddenly meant to be this like special motivational speaker or like the reasons that blah, blah, blah. But also like maybe having visions. But now I'm actually even more confused because then then I went to when you would tell me more experiences, I was like, and maybe you can talk to me about how you like relate to this substance if you want to talk about that but like you would so I'm a little bit animist I feel like your experience with ayahuasca is a bit animist and so that always made a lot of sense to me of your way of interacting with it and then I started to be like, oh, it's kind of more of like, I don't know, a much more like personal, almost dialogue type experiences between these realizations. Now I'm wondering, are there turtles and rainbows? Like, what the hell is happening in these tents?
Wow, that's such an interesting perspective. I'm glad to hear you say that, and I love what you said about that feeling that you had of like be looking into the fire and feeling that oneness and feeling that interconnection with all beings. Because I think really that is the fundamental part of the psychedelic experience. It's just delivered in so many different ways, and it's delivered in so many different ways based on um but it's like reinventing the wheel. Like we keep getting back to that same place, that same feeling that you already experienced, but we need to get there in a different way, like through a different path, through a different human experience we're having. So okay, so first of all, I do think it's important to distinguish, yeah, like whether you're and maybe we can focus on just like plant medicines, plant psychedelics rather than bringing in synthetic substances, which I think can also have value, but my I work more with plant medicines. So whether you're taking mushrooms or ayahuasca, and ayahuasca is actually made from, it's a tea brew. It's made from two different plants that come from the Amazon jungle that are combined together into a brew. Every single plant has a spirit. Every single, just like every little human or dog or squirrel, everything carries a spirit. So even every brew that I drink of ayahuasca is coming from two different plants that were harvested at a unique time by a different person. They were made into a different brew by a different person. There's different intention and energy going into each one. So every single psychedelic experience is different. Every single mushroom, every single mushroom and the type of mushroom, whether you're taking an albino mushroom or golden teacher, every type of mushroom has a unique kind of like lineage, but also a spirit. And that's why every experience is so different, and you can't really formulate it. You can't really describe you can't really have expectations. Every experience, and that's what makes it so fun and adventurous and fulfilling, but also very scary. Because like, to be honest, like I had always had really positive experiences with mushrooms until recently. I had never had, what people might call a bad trip. I still don't really believe in a bad trip. because I think there's always things you can learn and always things that you can extrapolate from the experience that guide us and help us. But mushrooms can fuck with you, like they can really they can really uncover maybe old wounds that maybe we were really just trying to leave alone for a bit. And they can bring up things that we didn't necessarily want to open up in that trip. So every experience can be really different. And it can depend a lot on, well, first of all, the plant you're taking, where you're taking it, who you're taking with it. There's also like the classic set and setting, like the environment that you're in, the music that's on, the people that you're around. And then there's also kind of the human experience that we're having outside of the trip. So if I just, got dumped and fired from my job, and then I go right into a ceremony, I'm bringing in all of this really kind of heavy energy that can be really powerful to work with. And sometimes, there's a shaman I follow that always says, like, a broken heart is an honest heart. So I think sometimes it can be good to bring in our pain and our trauma into the ceremonies, like with that raw openness. But sometimes it's too much. Sometimes it's too much. Sometimes we need to just kind of like take our human wounds and we need to just kind of just tend to them and just like apply a little, healing balm every day. We don't necessarily need to like go right in and be like, what does this mean? It can be very heavy. So I really think that, I mean, psychedelics are so powerful. But I do think it's very smart to go into psychedelic experiences with that openness of like, I don't know what's going to happen. And we do want to have tools um, that we can use to stay grounded in the experience. So it's really important before messing around with messing around, that's not the right verb. Before using psychedelics, to have other practices, to have a breathwork practice, to have a meditation practice, have ways to self-soothe. Like if you're just on a trip and you just start crying uncontrollably, how are you going to soothe yourself? Like I really always love like grabbing a pillow and just like hugging a pillow. And that's something I do in my regular life too. It's not just on psychedelics. So I think it's so important to work with these substances and accept like, all right, this is for my own healing. This is for my own good. I don't get to choose how I get there. I don't get to choose. I mean, we bring intention. We get to ask the medicines what we want to work with, but ultimately the medicines decide how we get there, how we arrive, and that can be really hard. When we're taking ayahuasca, should I keep going or should I
No, no,
pause?
no, you can keep going, but I have some follow-up questions.
Okay. But yeah, I also want to say with ayahuasca or there's a lot of purging that can happen. So that can be physical purging, a lot of vomiting, um, you know, diarrhea, like a lot of just like yawning or crying. It can be very physically uncomfortable. I've had an ayahuasca experience where I spent most of the ceremony throwing up. That does not sound like a fun way to spend Friday night, but for most people. But ultimately, at the end of the ceremony, I realized I had purged something. I felt so light and clean. I had purged something that I had been carrying that I really didn't want to carry anymore. And that was how the ayahuasca decided I would get it out of me. Um, a different ayahuasca experience I had, I was having some health problems going into it. And there's always like the fantasy. There's so many different ways that these medicines work. Like, there's kind of like this idea that like the little elves come in and do surgery and take out like part of you. And that can happen. But sometimes ayahuasca is actually really just like a lot more predictable and calm. And the message I got in that ceremony was like, drink water. And I was like, that's so boring. I don't want to drink water. I want to see the rainbows. I want the elves to operate on me. And then I just started drinking. I spent the whole ceremony drinking water. And afterwards, I felt amazing. And what the problems I had been carrying went away. And they went away through drinking a lot of water. So I guess this is a very long-winded way to say that it is the medicines, the plants that we choose carry spirits. Every experience is different, and there is really no way to be like, this is the psychedelic experience. But ultimately, what we are reaching for is exactly what you described, and what you've already experienced is that feeling of oneness. That feeling of oneness, almost that ultimate orgasm of like oneness with the universe, of feeling that we are connected to everything, of knowing that we are just pure love, of knowing that whatever we experience in this human form is okay, because ultimately we're all just going back to where we came from.
Wow. Okay, so a couple things I'm curious about came up for me. One is it reminded me that one of the perceptions I had about ayahuasca and psychedelics and any kind of altering substance um, was that I would have a complete lack of control of myself. And then learning about like the purging physically and the vomiting and all of that, like it just felt like almost like opening yourself up to lose your mind, have absolutely no control over like grounding yourself or anything. Like whatever's happening in your mind is just happening, and you're like at the mercy of however it goes. And then when you've talked to me about it, and when you're talking about it now, and you're saying like there's those tools, and like it sounds like you're almost, instead of your mind is going nuts, you're entering not a parallel universe, but some kind of world or land where you're more like a traveler. So it might be like, oh my God, this crazy dragon came out, or the little elves operated on me, but you're still like kind of almost consciously moving through this alternative place. And that's a massive distinction that makes me a lot more open to an experience like that than the thought of like, yeah, I think people just think they're going to lose control of all their bodily functions, their entire mind. Like they're just going to have a terrible time. Maybe it'll be good, you know?
Yeah. That's a beautiful way to put it. That's a beautiful way to put it. It is like that because ultimately, when you go through these experiences, you still are you. So if you really do the work on grounding yourself in daily life, through meditation, through breath work, through finding different ways to self-soothe, you carry that toolkit into these ceremonies. You don't just like lose that. So I think a lot of times the people who really struggle in ceremonies, and I've struggled in ceremonies too, but the people who kind of lose control of everything are the people who don't have those tools. And sometimes that happens. I've seen it happen in multiple ceremonies where people do kind of just start thrashing and screaming and crying, and they're like, "Get me off of this now." And that's usually a reflection, because we could also do that in real life. We could also like I go to the store, someone's rude to me, they don't have what I want. I have the choice in that moment to throw a tantrum, to like get really angry, or I mean that's not a good example because it would be more intense, but something really scary or hard happens to me. How do I react in that situation, like in regular life? And we don't always react perfectly, but hopefully we're doing the work on ourselves so we can handle those situations and move through those really hard situations with more ease and grace. And
Mhm.
that's why we're doing the work. So I think it's important. And what I've always found in these experiences is I have had really hard things come up. I have felt just like a ton of physical sensation that's really painful, or I've just spent like hours and hours like sobbing hysterically. But I always had the tools. I always knew underneath that, like I could take care of myself. So you do carry what you are, who you are in regular life. You carry that into ceremony as well.
Mhm. In on that note, the other thing that keeps coming to mind is, and I've actually heard this before in other people talking about psychedelics and stuff, but kind of like we need to have some responsibility for the experience. So like you're saying, like you don't want to go in. It's kind of like if you were going to climb Mount Everest, you don't want to just be like, okay, I'm going to do this. Like I'm in a really terrible place, so I'm going to climb a mountain.
Mhm.
You kind of do have to train a little bit almost with some of those mental tools. And it also brings up another fear that comes up, I think, for a lot of people, and including myself, which is, and it's okay if this is a problem, like you're saying, like there are people who have bad experiences, because I think it's good to know like how to approach these in a really like safe and meaningful way. But I mean, let's say you are repressing something in your psyche, because my impression of our mind is that we repress things until we're able to deal with them.
Mhm.
So what I perceive is that maybe the medicine, ayahuasca, whatever, could bring out things that we're not ready to process, that we are not psychologically kind of capable of handling. And I don't know, maybe it's a question of like just if your tools are strong enough, you can kind of face anything that comes up. Or are there, like, how would you answer to that? Like, the kind of like, are there, I guess that's where maybe one of my fears comes from is like, maybe certain things I'm just not ready to face. And like, what if they, again, what if I go crazy is my big, my big
Yeah.
fear, what if I have a nervous breakdown and I don't recover?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I would like to think that the medicine is so the medicine is working with what we're carrying inside of our bodies. We also, I mean, especially with ayahuasca, I to be honest, at this point in my life, and this could shift and change, I do think ayahuasca is a little bit safer to work with than if you do it like with with a shaman, with a group of people you trust, if you're held in ceremony. I think that can be safer to work with than just like taking mushrooms with your friends, because you're going into it like you're held by an expert, a professional. You're held by someone who can take care of you, if some of those things do come up and happen. um, I also think psychedelic therapy is an interesting model, where you're working with a therapist, and in the same way that you take mushrooms or you take MDMA, and you have the therapist to be there for you if some of those things do come up. You have someone to help you ground, like you have someone to be like, all right, like take a few deep breaths, let's go back here. So I think it's really helpful to have a trusted sitter, someone with experience. I don't know, the therapy model. We can talk about that if you want. I do think it's a little complicated because I think the person who can really be with you in some of these hard psychedelic moments is a person who has experience with psychedelics. It's
Yeah.
not a person. It's not a person who went to school for 7 years. That really has nothing to do with it. And I have seen that in the therapy model where people are serving as therapists, but they don't have experience with the medicine, and that's really a critical part in my perspective. But so I think it's so important to have that support, to do it with people that you trust, and that's the most important part of choosing any sort of ceremony. Is like, how do you feel with this person? What kind of training have they done? How many ceremonies have they sat in? What do they do if someone has that experience of psychosis or kind of losing control? Because if you feel supported, if you feel like someone else is there who can kind of help you in those difficult moments, it's not just all on you. It's not all on you. There can be that relax, there can be that surrender of like, okay, I'm going to fully trust this medicine, and I'm also going to know that I don't have to control it. If it goes too far, this shaman, this medicine woman, whomever is here to support me and help me. I think that's a big part of it. I think
That
it's only
reminds me on the therapy front. I guess it's kind of a little bit like almost like EMDR or something where the medicine is being used to trigger things and the
Mhm.
therapist is there to process them with you so that you're like opening up to get that stuff out that you otherwise might not be able to process on your own. So that I kind of like thinking about that makes me feel like, oh, that makes sense. And then same thing would happen with the shaman. It makes sense to me too that like you don't just have a relationship to the things you learn, you also have a relationship to the medicine itself and processing like how to go through coming up or down on things or like how to manage yourself during it. So it makes sense to me that that would not necessarily be something that somebody without experience in doing that particular psychedelic would know how to do like as a practitioner.
Mhm.
um Okay. Do you have any? I have a few more questions I can ask you, but do you have any questions for me about yourself that I should take a guess at?
Yeah, I guess I would as my friend. You've seen me, honestly, I think after most of the ceremonies, I've sent you like voice messages with all my insights.
Course.
So I would love to hear what your perception of those were, and how you were able to make sense of them, if you were, and if they were applicable to your life in any way.
Yeah. So on a meta level, They actually helped with my animism.
Mm.
So I have a friend here in Savannah who's kind of like witchy, and she introduced me to a lot of like just the kind of relating to things as if they were entities and things like that. But pairing that awakening with your experience of the medicine and how you would use the pronoun, like a female pronoun, a lot of times to describe it, I was like, oh, wow. It just kind of completely changed my perception of what these medicines can do, what they're about, like kind of what they can be for and more of a guide. And it just felt like it was so much more like definitive. I don't know, like that it was less like this like airy, maybe you come up with some cool thing that you remember later or not, and more like something you could like you like almost like going to the tarot or like going to a guru or something, like that you had this process with it where it was like you kind of go to the ayahuasca sometimes with questions, sometimes with just openness, whatever, and then you can you can take that with you in the same way I guess like people would like maybe even like go to a Tony Robbins conference. I don't know, but like where people have these different modalities of sort of finding answers or finding more parts of themselves or processing things. I just didn't ever really think of it as, I kind of thought like, oh, one does it and then what you get is what you get, and maybe, but I didn't think that it could be a repeat experience that you could commune with. And I also always found your realizations to be extremely profound. And to make everyone jealous, a lot of times we have this kind of connection where something that's going on with you or that you realize is like exactly what I needed to hear, do you know what I mean, or vice versa.
Mhm.
So that was always, I did always feel that element of like that almost like metaphysical, like, oh my God, I was talking to me too. And that kind of added another layer of sort of validity to like, wow, I think this experience that she's describing in this communing is with a very real thing.
Mhm.
Does that
Oh,
kind of,
yeah.
what would you say is the real truth?
The real truth in terms of what?
Like what your experience of it really, like,
Yeah.
am I
I
right?
I think you're totally right because I think ayahuasca, psychedelics, all they are doing is they're revealing who we are. And I think I went through this phase. I mean, obviously, they've been really profound and really helpful teachers on my journey. And I went through this phase where I was really obsessed with psychedelics. And I had my podcast, Psychedelic Science for the People. And I was just like, psychedelics are everything. Psychedelics will like save the world. And I was very like evangelist about it. And now I've realized that actually the psychedelics are just revealing who I am. And they're just taking away all of like the layers of sludge and like social constructs and identity and revealing who I am. And so now I'm actually way more obsessed. I'm way less obsessed with psychedelics or ayahuasca, and I'm just way more interested in who I am underneath all of this. And that's really just like the divinity that's within me and the divinity that's within all of us. And that source and that spirit, and I guess you could say God if you're using that, if you use that language, but that's what I'm more interested in now. And I do believe that that can be revealed in so many different ways. Psychedelics are a great place to start if we're having a hard time trusting that voice. And I think that was my experience for a long time. Like I always knew I was like a writer. I always knew I had these really kind of profound, almost like channeling experiences when I was writing, but I didn't fully trust that. I didn't fully think that that was real. I thought I was like, oh, I'm just kind of wasting time and I need to like get back to my job, you know? I didn't trust how important that practice was. So I think, and even like what you were saying too, of how sometimes I'll be experiencing something and you're experiencing it at the same time, and that brings us together. Like that's bigger than us. That's bigger than ayahuasca. You know, and not that ayahuasca isn't big, but there's something really interesting that's happening there, and it's like our souls are traveling these paths, and then we intersperse. It's really interesting, and I think my goal or my intention now is not to just like give all the power to the medicine. The power is within us. The power is within me. The power is within you. The power is within anyone. You don't have to do these things to realize how powerful you are and how much you contain, and how mystical the human experience can really be.
And when you're experiencing and communing with ayahuasca, what is it that you perceive or who are you communing with, in the sense of like, who do you perceive? Because I have this as a creative too, like, who is coming up with this story, or like, who's coming up with this idea? Like, is it like some aspect of the universe? Is it a little spirit guide? Is it some unconscious part of me? Like, and so with ayahuasca, you're saying that, each tea basically has a spirit. So do you feel that you are communing with that spirit and it is helping you to understand yourself better? Or do you feel like it's almost mirroring you back and it's almost your voice?
That's such a great question. And I think it's a bit of both. So I within so ayahuasca, as I explained, like it's made from two different plants within the Amazon. And there's also kind of almost like I guess its sibling, which is called yahe, and that is made from typically made from plants found more in the Ecuador region of the Amazon jungle. And the first time I did it, the medicine woman said, she was like, yeah, it has a more of a masculine energy. And I was like whatever, probably not gonna feel that at all. And I definitely felt the masculine energy. I definitely felt it was way harder on me. It was way like I felt like the medicine almost like colonizing my body. I felt this really harsh, almost like grandfatherly voice, like speaking to me. And yeah, so I think that's very real, is the different types of medicine and the spirits, where it's come from, where it's harvest. So after that experience with Yahe, I don't really feel called to it. I definitely learned from that experience, but for me, just as a very highly sensitive creature, I don't need to learn from that voice. I don't need to learn from that plant energy. It doesn't really, I don't really connect with it. So I think that's an important to listen to that instinct, and to think like, yeah, it's kind of like there's so many different ways to learn the lessons that we need to learn, and part of that is like honoring who we are and what plants we connect with, and even within kind of that particular plant, like there are certain types of mushrooms that I do not want to take, because they're too much. They're just not like, I don't connect with them. The spirit energy is not meant for my spirit energy. So I think that that is very true and real, and it happens in this realm. And yeah, absolutely. Every time we go into ceremony, we're a different person. Something else is coming through us. We're working with a different element of the human experience. And every time we're in a human, I really truly believe that all experiences are teachers and all people are mirrors. So whatever we're carrying, whatever is bugging us or frustrating us, no matter how small, and this is what I love about working with ayahuasca. Like even if it's almost like, okay, like one time this girl had kind of made a petty comment to me. Like she was kind of a friend of me. Like she was an acquaintance, but not a real friend. But she had made this comment to me that was very triggering. And it felt so petty. And I didn't even feel like it was worth bringing it up in the ceremony. Like, of course, in the ceremony, I had a more grandiose intention. But then when I was further along in the ceremony and I was actually speaking to the ayahuasca, it occurred to me, I was like, why am I so triggered by what that girl said to me? And the answer that she gave me, the ayahuasca, was very profound, and it was very revealing of a deep insecurity I had, and like something that was living inside of me. And I realized that actually a lot of times these things that bother us, like that petty nagging, is actually like, it's actually meant to teach us. It's actually meant to show something about ourselves. So ayahuasca doesn't like only work with the heaviest things in our life. It's not only like we can only bring deep grief or deep loss. No, we get to bring, that like that weird fling that we had for 2 months with someone who ghosted us. We get to bring that like to the ayahuasca as well, because that can also be a powerful teacher. So it's like ayahuasca understands that we're all like living the wounds of the world through these micro interactions, through our human experiences, and she will work with us on these smaller things, because they reveal so much about who we are and where we need to grow and where we need to learn. And I think that's also a common, definitely a misconception I had before working with this type of medicine, was like, you can only go in with like the highest intention, or you can only think about, the really intense, almost like if we put trauma on a hierarchy, like she's only here to help us with like the top hierarchy of trauma, and that is not true. And that has just freed me up in so much of my life, because now I work with everything that comes up for me, even the small things. I look at them and I honor them, and I'm like, oh yeah, that petty comment, that sucked for me. That was really painful, because that brought up this insecurity that I had from when I was 12, and the popular girl said this to me, or whatever it is. Like, we honor ourselves, we honor our human experiences, because even these tiny little things that happen to us reflect all of the wounds that we experience in the world. And that brings us back to kind of like, because when we disown our own little small traumas, we disown ourselves. And then when we're not making space for our own emotional experience, we can't really make space for the emotional experiences of other people. And then we're kind of constant, and everyone has this experience where you're like, and whether it's from your parents or whoever, people are invalidating your experience, and they're like, well, get over it, it's not that big of a deal, like move on, like other people are suffering and in wars, and we create this hierarchy of trauma where we only allow ourselves to feel certain things, and it's a massive disservice to the entire collective, because then we keep carrying these little things within us, and we just keep projecting the same wounds onto other people. So at this point in my life, and this is so much of my writing right now, my book that I'm working on, I never would have had the courage to write this 5 years ago, or even 4 years ago, or 3 years ago, because what I've learned through the medicine is that actually, like, honoring our wounds, healing our wounds, writing and talking about our wounds is of service. It's of service to other people, so they can do that for themselves.
That leads me to, I think this might be our final question, but I'm getting like envious that you have this in your life. But I also want you to take a guess at what you think would be my closest equivalent to ayahuasca in my life, to your experience of ayahuasca in my life.
So something I really admire about you, and I am also envious of, is just how you experience love. How you experience love, and you experience love in a way that is not structured, that is not how we're socially conditioned to experience love, romantic love especially. Because I feel that we're very socially conditioned to experience romantic love in a monogamous way, where we find one person, they're our person, and we settle down forever. And I think, knowing you, like, you have disowned a lot of heteronormative patriarchal conditioning, and you found a lot of ways to love and to be free in love, and to connect with different types of partners, and I think that has allowed you to connect with different types of yourself that might have laid dormant if you had kind of disowned it. And I know it wasn't easy to get there. I know you struggled a lot to accept this, and you had to also disown a lot of, disown is not the right word, but um yeah, like a lot of elements of growing up Christian, growing up in a certain type of environment. Yeah, it wasn't like you were just exposed like, oh yeah, free love, or like, or that polyamory is an acceptable way to be. So yeah, so for that's also a huge psychedelic. That's a psychedelic is anything that can, like, open up our minds to think about how to move beyond the social constructs, and to think about living our lives in a different way, that is not handed to us, that's not like the perfect path, that society gives us. So that's something that I always have really admired in you, and I think you're so free, and you're so open to love, because you don't think it just has to come from this, like, one particular person in this one particular way.
Wow. This is like the multipleth time that I've learned something already about myself that I did not know from someone else. Um That makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think you're right in the way that you talk about ayahuasca, and that there's messages that you get from it and realizations you get and wounds that you heal and things like that. I mean, I do very much appreciate connecting with people in, someone once said to me, there's many colors of love. And I have found that to be a really powerful experience in my life that, yeah, I do think I very much experience, and I was thinking about this. It's like my own version of love on the spectrum, a different kind of spectrum, but like the spectrum of love, which is that like there's just it's very hard to classify, I think sometimes, like, oh yeah, this type of feeling for this person or this type of bond with them. Like every single one feels to me like a slightly different like color or shape or experience, and there's different, I almost like feel like energies within myself rise to the surface with different people. And so I think it's been interesting for me to explore that more consciously, um, and recognize it's so funny. And I wonder if you even have that with the psychedelics in some way, but where you've been living a way of being without even the tool that you now use to do it, but that like over the course of my life I've related to people in certain ways and made choices I wasn't necessarily conscious I was making to have these experiences, and now it's a little bit more conscious of like, how do I navigate all those things? So yeah.
Oh, I love that. I love that.
Yeah,
I think that's something, if I can just make a final comment. Can we
please.
talk forever? Uh,
No, go on, add what you
if I
like.
can just make a final connection point between the two, really the purpose of doing psychedelics is not about doing the psychedelics. It's not about that 8 hours I spent in the ayahuasca ceremony, or that time I spent. That's actually not the point. That's not the experience that matters. What matters about the psychedelic experience is how it sheds light, and how it creates, like, how we have a deeper knowing as we move through every single experience. So I can bring that consciousness to, having dinner with my family, to having this conversation with you, to sitting. I was just sitting outside my building, and I was watching a cat like chase a butterfly, and eventually he killed the butterfly, and it was so sad, but it was also just really beautiful to like just watch nature in my, like, just existing in that way, because I bring the consciousness to that. I'm awake, I'm aware of what's happening. And I loved what you're saying about these relationships, that in the beginning it was kind of just like your soul being like, all right, well, I'm attracted to this person, and like, I don't care. But your ego kind of probably resisted that, because it was like, well, why? Like, this doesn't make sense to me. So I think that's the power that you have now at getting older and getting and growing up more, of like having that consciousness and being like, oh, this is a conscious choice I'm making. I'm not just doing this because, like, it's not like clouded by shame of this is wrong, or this isn't how you should be doing it. It's like you're making these choices, and you're also conscious. You're conscious of the choices you're making.
So what that is making me think of is like, people think of psychedelics as drugs,
Mm.
and they think of it as sort of chasing experiences, like, oh, okay, maybe you don't want like a high like you get on cocaine, but you enjoy like all these pretty kaleidoscope things.
Mm.
And in both of our cases with what we're talking about as almost like modalities for self discovery and expression, I mean, I think there can be a point, and sometimes people are introduced to things by chasing experiences, but that's not really what it is for you. It's certainly not what it is for you as far as I've known about it. It's not about chasing feelings. It's about finding yourself and embodying yourself.
Yeah. And that's the premise of, that's the premise of the whole thing. And with that perspective, really anything can be a psychedelic. Anything that expands our consciousness is essentially a psychedelic. I mean, that can be, like, I was just thinking, like, wow, something I'm writing about now is like the ego death of learning a new language. That's a psychedelic experience, because it expands our awareness and our consciousness, and we're not just like swimming in the water of like what we always know. And yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to love, and perhaps sometimes why we need to have more experiences in love, and we can't just settle down with our high school sweetheart and live happily ever after, even though that would be ideal. That's definitely
People
what I
do. Yeah.
I know, that's what I want for my next lifetime, if I come back, because I do think there's so much there, that can be so much, that can just feel really good, and that could be a really beautiful path. But I think sometimes it's just, yeah, we need these different people to reveal who we are, to show us what we long for, to show us what we are underneath all of this. Sometimes it can't just be one person. Um, but we're also different. So I think it's just, we just have to honor who we are.
Well, that is a fantastic way to end. I am so honored to have you on here, and I feel like that was a really interesting conversation that I hope our audience and know our audience will have found something really, really powerful from. So, before we go, tell us where people can find you. Is there, socials, things like that, where they can check you out?
Yeah, so I write a Substack, I write a newsletter once a month, and it's called the Freebird Hotel. So Freebird Hotel, maybe I can just send you the link so people can have that. But yeah,
Mhm.
that's really where I unleash a lot of my ideas about um existentialism, about like, why are we here, what does it mean to be human. I do write about psychedelics to some extent, but kind of, I think, just as I was talking earlier, I think I only write about psychedelics in the way of like revealing bigger things about like human truth, or how I move through the world. So yeah, so that's my favorite way to connect with people.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Emily, and see you next time.
Thank you so much.
Bye.